For us, Belgians, chaplaincy has a Christian connotation. Of course, also pastoral care. And Simon, who is, I think, the responsible in the UK for the chaplaincy or the counselling, he said that, and I'll quote, this problem is the biggest issue that consumes my life. So I propose that, oh, that's too early. For me, chaplaincy, I will use the term chaplaincy when I'll talk about a certain category of clients. So, for example, people that are imprisoned, or patients in hospitals, or people who live in houses for elderly people, the military, the university, and so on. So, very specific categories. While I will use the term counselor or humanist counselor for those working with, I call it population in general. So people who are not imprisoned or so on, who are in demand of some help on a humanist base. First, I have to admit I'm Belgian. I will talk also about the Belgian situation, but the question or the problem of helping people with one's life stance question, existential problems, questions about meaning of life, and all this from a secular humanist point of view, it was first raised by the Dutch humanist Jaap van Praag. You see his picture. He was the founder of the Dutch Humanist Association, I think in 1951. And he also played an important role, as you can see, and also Giovanni, I think, mentioned it. I think in 1964 they founded the HOI, which means the Humanist Training Institute. You could compare it, I think, now with what we would call a bachelor, more or less. And I think later on, no, I don't think, I'm sure about it, later on it became a real university, the University for Humanist Studies. It's in Utrecht. And there you can, amongst other things, you can learn to become a humanist counselor, let's call it in those terms. And it takes about 6 years to get a master degree in humanistics as humanist counselor. So, I was asked, to talk about all these different things. So first of all, I would like to say something more about, let me see, what is humanist counseling about. Then about some practical examples of humanist chaplaincy and counseling. And I was also asked to talk a little bit about how to start the process to have chaplaincy and counselors recognized by the state. And I will end by saying something more about the EHP. So what is humanist counseling about? That's white, yeah. First, I think it has to do with secular humanist identity. Secondly, we have to talk about the method. And thirdly, about the content of the counseling, to understand it. Sorry, I'm not a native English speaker, so I apologize for my bad English. So the secular humanist identity. I think it has to do with free thinking, as we call it, as they say in French, libre examen, so free inquiry. It's based on the belief, I think, in science and reason. That's very important. Secondly, it has, of course, to do with humanist values. Like a very important value in the counseling or in chaplaincy is self-determination. I think every human being has the right to make his or her own decisions. Very important. And of course, as a counselor or a chaplain, you have to respect these personal choices. Of course, the value of equality is also very important, and I mean that in the relationship between counselor and, as we call them, our clients. Thirdly, the autonomy of the client. That means the complete acceptance of the other, of course. So that about this secular humanist identity. Second point is the methods that are used. Of course, as a counselor, you have to be there for the other person. Open listening, also very important. Open questions. Giving room for pain, for sorrow, doubt, and so on. And of course, working without time pressure, which is also very important. Then the focus, which is, I think, very important, and that makes also the distinction between, I think, counseling and psychological help and support. We are focusing on existential questions. I have to look a bit in my text. Sorry, I'm a bit confused. Well, I do it by heart. Existential problems, where do we come from, why are we alive, and so on. Why do we have to suffer and experience losses, and so on. Secondly, it has counseling and chaplaincy has to do with meaning of life. Also giving sense to one's life. And giving sense, it was a theory that was developed, I think, in America by Roy Baumeister, who was a social psychologist. And his model, it was also used at the University for Humanist Studies in the Netherlands. Baumeister says that human beings, they have 4 needs for experience, sense and meaning to life. And the first one is that you have a perspective in life. You have certain goals that are pretty clear. The second need for meaning is that, or to experience meaning, that you need a certain grip or the feeling that you have a control about your life. The third one is a certain degree of self-esteem, which is, I think, on its own very clear. And fourth, he says that every human being needs, in a certain way, to justify him or herself, and you need values, more specific moral values for that. And the more coherent and clear these values are to yourself, also it helps to experience more meaning and giving sense to your life. So let me talk now about some practical examples of chaplaincy and counseling. So what I will tell now is the Belgian experience about, first of all, in the Belgian army we had, we call it, I think, aumôners, since the First World War, because it was, took 4 or 5 years, so there were Christian aumôners in the army, and so when the Humanist Association was created in the early 50s, one of the first demands in Belgium of this Humanist Association was to get free-thinking or humanist chaplains, I will call them, in the Belgian army. They didn't succeed, and it was until the late 90s of the last century that we finally got our humanist chaplaincies in the Belgian army. Not as much as in the Netherlands. I just heard yesterday that in the Netherlands, the Dutch army, they have about 38 or 39 full-time humanist chaplains, which is enormous, I think. In Belgium, we have 7. These people, they go along on, for example, when a military vessel goes to the Gulf or so on for a couple of months, there is a chaplain on board. It can be a Christian chaplain, or it can be a secular humanist, or there's not enough space on board of the ships to have all the different life stances. So I know that also our humanist chaplaincy has been in Afghanistan, where the Belgian Army defends the airport. They have been in Lebanon, and so on and so on. So they are quite active, as they are, of course, also in the Dutch army. So in prisons, that was the first realization of the humanist movement in Belgium. I think in 1964 they had an experiment in 2 prisons. Humanist volunteers, chaplains, were allowed, and this experiment was positively evaluated. And so starting, I think, from 1964-65, humanist chaplains on a voluntary basis were admitted in Belgian prisons. Later on, they also became professionalized. And I think now there are about 9 full-time equivalents of professional humanist chaplaincies for the Belgian prisons, and together with the volunteers. Most of them, of these 9 persons, they are with more than 9, because they are not working full time, because it's a very mentally very So they work half time or part time anyway. So, but there are 9 full time equivalents. Then in the hospitals, it was a little bit more complicated, also as in the Netherlands, for example, because when you want chaplains in the armed forces or in the prisons, you can negotiate with one department, the Ministry of Justice or the Ministry of Defense. When you want chaplains in hospitals or in houses for the elderly people, you have to negotiate with every hospital or big city who has public hospitals and so on, always on their terms, different terms, so it's quite complicated. Nevertheless, also there, at the beginning of the 70s, humanist chaplains were allowed to enter the hospitals and got a legal status. And for many years, we worked with volunteers that were trained, of course, and so on. But after maybe about 10 years in the hospitals where our volunteers were doing very effectively their job, we started negotiating, and at this moment we have about, in Flanders, it's not in Belgium, Flanders, we have about 20 professional humanist chaplains in most of the, not most, in public hospitals and houses for the elderly people, together with about, I think, around about 100 voluntary chaplains. So it's a typical Belgian story. I will tell you very briefly. In Antwerp, there were 3 universities, which was typical Belgian. There was a Catholic university, there was a pluralistic university, and there was a state university. And none of these 3 universities was a whole university. They had parts of, for example, the one the bachelor, the other one's the master degree, and so on. So after more than 10 years of negotiating, it became finally one university. But of course, the Catholic, the former Catholic university, they had 3 Catholic chaplains. And of course, they didn't want to lose them. So then you get this typical Belgian solution. Okay, then you secular humanist, you get 1 full-time humanist counselor for the university. So in Antwerp, we have a full-time humanist chaplain or counselor at the university. So now, until now, I talked about chaplaincy. Now I will talk about counseling. So I use the word counseling, as I said, for the humanist services we deliver to public in general and not to specific categories. This is part of Belgium. It's the northern part. It's the Dutch-speaking part. It's called Flanders. The situation is quite different, I think, in the French-speaking part, so I will limit myself to the part that I know best, and I'm working in myself. Let me see. That's where I work and live in Antwerp. As I said, in the 50s, also in Belgium or in Flanders, we got we had the first, the Humanist Association. But in the early 70s, we founded an umbrella organization. It's called Unie-Vrijzinnige Verenigingen, called now Demens.nu. It was an umbrella organization with about 35, more or less, member organization, amongst which was the Humanist Association, but also all kind of different free-thinking organizations. And, well, the goal was to get what we call in Belgium the recognition of secular humanism as an official life stance. And to get an equal treatment according to the 6 recognized religions in Belgium. So that's a very particular situation. When Belgium became independent in 1830, we had a very progressive constitution at that time. And one of the articles, which was less progressive, it came from Napoleon, because the territory before that was occupied by the French army, by Napoleon. And I have to go back further in time. During the French Revolution, the goods of the church were confiscated by the revolutionaries and they were sold publicly. So the French clergy came without income, because they lost their farms and their abbeys and their ground and so on and so on. So as a compensation later on, Napoleon, they voted a law that said that the wages and the pensions of the French priest will be paid by the French state, by the French government, as a compensation for the loss of income. And so when Napoleon invaded what later became Belgium, this was general legislation. And then when Belgium became independent in 1830, this article was introduced in the Belgian constitution. So afterwards it was abolished in France by another revolution. There are many revolutions, and they have a complete separation of state and church now in France since 1905. But in Belgium we still have this Napoleonic law, and it's in our constitution. So it says that the wages and the pensions of different priests are paid by the government. And so in 1830 it was Catholic religion that was, we call it, recognized. Also Protestantism, because our first king was a Protestant, Leopold I. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Anglicanism. Later on, Orthodox religion was also recognized, Judaism and Islam somewhere in the 70s. So all their personal, the priests or imams or rabbis and so on, they are paid by the Belgian government. But because we have a separation between state and church, states or the government can't interfere with the religious affairs. They can't refuse the appointment of a bishop, of a priest or imam or whatever. They don't interfere. So when this umbrella organization in the 70s was founded, the ambition was to get, I call it secular humanism. The ambition was to get secular humanism recognized by the Belgian government as the seventh life stance that gets money and means from the Belgian state. So in 1981, they said, well, you're not organized enough and maybe you're not socially relevant enough at this moment, but we give you a small amount of money and start organizing yourself and start, doing things, getting service to the population like the different churches were doing. And so this was the beginning, after a few years, of the counseling. We got at that moment, I think, I call it Houses for Humanist Services. It's a bad translation, but translation is not always that easy. At different places in Flanders, in the capitals of the 6 provinces, so Antwerp, Bruges, Ghent, Hasselt, Brussels, and Leuven. And there we started. I was one of the pioneers at the beginning of the 80s with one counselor and administrative help. And we were already then focusing on ceremonies, helping also to train volunteers and so on. So every year we got a little bit of more money, and they invented a rule that every year we got 10% more. Now, I don't know if you know something about mathematics, so in the beginning it grows very, very, very slowly, and we were very, very frustrated. But then it went a little bit better and better and better, and you know what happens. So the politicians also saw this problem, and that was one of the reasons, I think, that they said, okay, we're going to recognize you and you get some different laws. So incredible, but true, in 1993, the Belgian constitution was changed. And so this article who says that the wages and the pensions of the priests are paid by the government, there was added a phrase that also the wages and the pensions, I call it now of the humanist counselors, are paid by the Belgian state. So that was the constitution. So we were officially recognized, but we needed another special law to make this work out. So we were still paid with a yearly subsidy that was growing. And then finally in 2002, the special law on the 21st of June, International Humanist Day, that was coincidence, but that was nice. they voted the law, and so people like Niels and myself, humanist counselor, from then on are paid by the Belgian government, and also our pension is taken care of which I will enjoy from the 1st of September. So in the meantime, we got much more houses for humanist services. We call them Huizen van de Mens, but it's very difficult to translate and to give it at the same time a meaning. So we have about, as you can see on the map of Flanders, we have about more or less 30 houses for humanist services, where there are working normally 5 people for humanist counselors and administrative support. All these people are paid by the government to deliver humanist services to the population. Flanders has a population, I think, of about maybe 6.5 million inhabitants, I think. So what are these humanist counselors doing? Well, they are doing humanist ceremonies, name giving. They are helping the humanist teachers when they are asked for to support them with organization of the coming of age ceremonies, like we call Lentefeest, spring rite, more or less, for children that are 6-year-old and start there at the elementary school, their course of humanist ethics. And feestvrijzinnige jeugd, which is comparable to, I think, humanist confirmation, but for children that are 12 years old and you're leaving the primary school. Yeah, thank you. So also weddings, of course, funerals, and also since I think about 4 or 5 years, I don't know if the right English term, memorial ceremonies or commemorate, is it that also? Memorial. So, yeah, okay. So, for example, to remember the deceased or the military deceased, for example, of the Second World War and so on. I've been doing that for many, many years. At the military cemetery in Antwerp, together with colleagues from the other life stances, the religions, but also for people, the family of the people who died, for example, the last 2 or 3 years. We organize a global ceremony to commemorate the death. It's quite working well, and at these gatherings we have maybe about 250 people. They are invited and they can come or they don't come, they have to subscribe. And every year a new ceremony and new symbols and so on are developed, so that every year it's a completely different ceremony. With live music, of course, with speeches, poems, and so on. Our colleagues, they offer ceremonies to the population. Of course, we have now about, I forgot to tell you, I think we have about 165 professionals working in these houses paid by the government. Of these 165, there are about 20 people working at the headquarters in Brussels. And the others are working in the houses. So because they are not enough to cover all the demand for the ceremonies, we also have a lot of we are very lucky to have a lot of volunteers also doing humanist services. And if you go into the team of ceremonies, it's very, very, I think, comparable with the stories that we heard from Thala and also from Scotland. So it's exactly the same based individual. The training and so on is also very, very comparable. then they are doing, of course, humanist counseling. So people who have a problem, existential problems, questions, often after suffering a severe loss, personal loss, they are welcome and they can get counseling from our counselors, more or less in a way as I told you before. Also, our humanist counselors, they're doing what we call humanist community building, helping the local humanist communities when they ask for or when they need help, or in a certain way you could call them also agents for secularization. We also have many quite new, for example, crematoria, which are, strange enough, also places or instruments for secularization. And all this, well, it clicks together. So I was also asked how to start a process to have chaplaincy and counselors recognized by the state. Of course, the Belgian story with the houses for humanist services is a very particular one, but nevertheless, I think there are two things which are valuable to mention. Of course, you first have to prove that there's a need, and that was already said, I think, also by the former speakers. And secondly, you have to prove your social relevance. I'll go back. Let's see if I can tell a little bit more about that. Yeah. So first of all, the need. It's about that secular humanists, or also people like other people, religious people, for example, people with doubts, questions about life, meaning of life, who am I, where do I come from, where are we going to, what's the meaning of life, of my life, why do we have to suffer, why do we have to undergo pain, etc., etc. So non-religious people have to deal with exactly the same questions and problems as religious people. And they have, as a consequence, the same existential or philosophical needs. And secondly, I think you have to prove, and that was also said, I think, by Fraser, that you have to prove that your lifestyle, so humanism, is socially speaking, that it is relevant, that we have our own views, for example, based on science and reason, that we are sufficient numerous. You have to start experimenting. I mean, you have to start experiments using volunteers, for example, and we had several examples that there where volunteers started to do humanist services like counseling in prisons or in hospitals, and they were successful, so we could prove, so to say, that we were social relevant and that non-religious people had the same needs, and then you can use that as an argument to get also professional paid counselors, especially when in these domains like army, prisons, hospitals and so on, and also in what we call, I have to think, parochies. Can somebody help me? Parish, yeah, the parishes where there are priests and so on. So then you can use this as an argument to get a more or less equal treatment. So let me end with telling you something about European Humanist Professionals very briefly. We have a mission, of course, and that's in the following areas. Of course, about ceremonies, education, teachers, counseling and chaplaincy, as I told you about, healthcare and social care. And for the moment, I think what we are missing a little bit in our board or commission and also in our network is humanist professionals that are working in the administration in the different countries and in the management, and also public relations, the media. So if we look at the EHP as it is working now, we focus on ceremonies, education, and counseling and chaplaincy, but we would welcome also the other domains, working domains. EHP was founded, I think, around 74. It's quite an informal organization. We didn't have a legal status until last year. We were a network, an informal network of sometimes also of friends that organized activities. Activities like, for example, the upcoming Congress in Bruges in beginning of October. I could find the leaflets outside. I also brought some extra leaflets with me about expressing humanist values in education, chaplaincy, and ceremonies. And then for 2020, there will be organized a summer school by our Dutch colleagues in the neighborhood of Utrecht. I think with strong support also of the University for Humanist Studies about counseling, very specific about counseling. And then we're also negotiating with our Berlin friends about a working visit to Berlin. So working visits, congresses, summer schools, electronic newsletter, the website, that are the instruments with which European Humanist Professionals try to realize their goals, and their goals is exchange of best practices amongst humanist professionals in Europe. So here you find again the program for the Bruges conference on the 4th, 5th and 6th of October. We try to organize it that with a very low entry level, so we make it as cheap as possible, cheap in the literal meaning of the word. I think we will ask 175 euros to attend the 3 days, including 2 dinners, 3 lunches, and all coffee breaks and so on. It is.
It's open to everyone worldwide, not just European people.
Of course, we are named European Humanist Professionals, but if people interested from America, from the north of America, of Africa, or whatever, of course they are welcome. Of course. So I don't want to read the whole program once again, but just mention that Hans Alma, who was a former professor at the University for Humanist Study, is coming. She has a very interesting new book about humanistic pluralism and how to live together. There's an interesting film about it's about the attacks, the terrorist attacks in Brussels, and how children from different cultural background react to them. There's a very interesting speaker of the Belgian Institute for Deportation that has a very interesting theories about how to deal with populism and extreme right thoughts. And then Andrew Cobson will have the closing words. But of course, not the closing words, that will be the president of the EHP, but has a speech on humanist values in a changing world. But I think the most important thing of these congresses is is to facilitate exchange, and there will be a lot of time and opportunities to talk with each other, to laugh also, but to also to share the material that is produced in every country, and to exchange experiences and best practices. I have no idea how long had I talked. It's here. Oh.
Yeah, 43 minutes.
Sorry.
All right. Anyway, thank you, Freddy, for this presentation.